everyone. You've
Hi.
made it through the, hello everyone. Let's wave it out. And to everybody at home watching and checking out, you made it through to the last session of the day at the Winter Park Library Book Festival. But it's not last but least, but that they saved the best for last. And so that's what you've come into. My name is Toya Rochelle, and I'll be moderating today's panel, which is well-versed in all backgrounds. But before we get started, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and also just kind of give a little shout out to the folks that brought us together. So last year, the Winter Park Book Festival was supposed to happen, and we all know what happened, and we weren't able to do so. And here we are a whole year later. And funny, we're still kind of making our way, but things are a lot lighter, a lot better than we were around this time last year. So I think it's really important to just say a special thanks to everybody at the Winter Park Library. They did a great job pulling us together, really looking at what happened last year and a way for us, like creatives, curators, bloggers, people that are really interested in the written word, to have a conversation because we're not the same people we were a year ago. So thanks to everybody over at the Winter Park Library. And I would be remiss if I should do a super shout out to Rochelle over and everybody at the Writers Atelier. I hope that it's not the best kept secret anymore. And everything that they produce over at the studio is amazing. So thank you to Rochelle for bringing us together. And today's full roster was really impactful, lots of good discussion, lots of things to think about. I kind of joined in the last session about curation because I was kind of keen to hear what they were talking about. And so here we are. So that's the table setting. We did our shout outs. Before we get started, let's do a little bit of round robin, a little intros, and then we can jump right in. So somebody can just start. I don't want to pick. Who wants to introduce themselves first?
You didn't introduce yourself.
Introduce yourself, yes.
Wait a minute. Oh, but okay. Let's correct that. Toya Rochelle, local creative. I'm here in Central Florida. We were talking just a little bit ago about how we got into poetry and that it, really wasn't intended to share. My first collection is probably just that. I took 20 years of writing and put it into a collection and put it out into the world. And so that's a little bit about me. I love the written word. I've published poetry, but I'm also very keen on producing short stories and have over the years, as well as a little children's book as well. So that's that's my introduction. So I'll pass the virtual mic to whoever would like to go next.
And I think I'll go next. Hi, everybody. My name is Lana Issam Ghannam, or Ghannam in English, I suppose. And I am a first-generation Palestinian American. So my parents were married, they came over here. My siblings and I were born and raised in Central Florida. And from what I understand, Native Floridians, that's a weird thing. So the fact that I was born and raised in Central Florida, and now I have two kids who were born and raised in Central Florida, I find it kind of ironic that I went from first generation to now my children are second generation. I think that's really fun. I have one chapbook published, Two Tongues. This is the title behind me. It came out in 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And I actually have my second chapbook forthcoming this summer. That's called Evolution of Stone. And that's kind of about the end of the world. So I thought that was pretty convenient. Thank you for having me on a happier note.
Who wants to introduce themselves next?
I'll go next. My name is Tamara Madison, and thank you for having me as well, and for being persistent and making sure that this happened instead of just letting it go to the wash. I am a poet first, poet first. I dabble in fiction, and Lana, I'm like you. When I grow up, I would like to write a novel, right? When I grow up.
One day.
But I dabble in fiction, and I dabble in fiction and, you know, do some editing as well. But poetry is my first language. I've been writing poetry ever since I was a teenager. And in school, it was therapy for many, many, many years. And I'm here in Central Florida as well. Oh, and I should say, I forgot. Thank you, Lana, for reminding me. My newest collection of poetry is Threed This Road, Not Damascus, and it's out by Trio House Press.
Woo-hoo. All right, Robin.
Awesome. Well, so I'm Robin Gal. Similarly, I feel like I'm like a poet of center, but I also like to write other genres too. And I write young adult books. So my first young adult book is in verse and it's coming out next winter. And then I'm the author of, why am I blanking on my own things? A poetry collection by Tolson Books that came out in October. And then I also had a chapbook right before the pandemic hit. It's called Honeysuckle. So yeah, that's kind of me.
Okay, great. Wonderful introductions. So we're all friends in the written word here. We're going to jump right into it. But before we do, I think it would be helpful for folks, and you guys mentioned it a teeny tiny bit in your intros, but I want to double click on it a little bit more in that. And my question is to kind of give people some grounding is what brought you to poetry specifically? So rewind many years ago, you thought like, okay, I'm going to write something. What brought you to it? And so Lana, since you started intros, I'll go with you, and then anybody else, you can jump into the combo as well.
Okay, funny story. I wrote essays and stuff for school. I would win the random contests here or there in elementary school, and I didn't think anything of it. It was just like, oh, just words on a page. It wasn't until middle school when my family and I we grew up with very little money. It was 4 kids. My parents were immigrants. So I remember it was my best friend's birthday. I was 12 years old. I didn't even want to ask for the $2 to go buy a birthday card. So I wrote her something similar to like a Hallmark little birthday card. I was calling her my sister and everything. And you know what? I was like, you know what? I can probably do more of these. That way I never have to buy another greeting card again. And my mom got me a little, like one of those spiral bound notebooks, spiraled at the top so I could just write and then flip and write and flip. And I remember being so proud and sharing those with her. And when I looked back at them, I was like, oh, that was terrible. Those were terribly written. But I think that was the first time I wrote poetry. And I didn't take it seriously. I did some more in high school. It was, again, therapeutic for me, something that I did for myself. That was my diary, was just random poetry. I didn't take it seriously until I got to undergrad and college when I just took it as electives because I wanted to be a fiction writer and realized I was way stronger in poetry. And so I ran with it.
Thanks for that. Tamara. Would you mind sharing, Tamara, what brought you to poetry initially?
I think I was born into it. I would say that I was born into it because I honestly know that the language of Black people is poetry, right? When you look at the idioms, when you look at the rhythms, when you look at the storytelling aspect, the colorful aspect, I mean, our tongues are colorful, right? And so I was born into it. And then being born into a lineage of Baptist ministers, you know, the whole thing of the sermon is also, it has its own poetry. The Bible has its own poetry as well. So I was obviously just born into it, and it caught my ear. I was always interested in the way that people told stories and the rhythms of language. And then somewhere, I'm guessing like maybe middle school, I was blessed. There was a local library in the neighborhood right next to the basketball court and the park. And I remember there was a Black librarian there who showed me like the poetry section in the library. And that was just so exciting because I felt out of place a lot of the time in other places because I love to read and I love to write. And, you know, most kids weren't interested in that. But in that spot in the library, that was home. Even though I didn't understand everything that I read, it was home. And then, as Lana said, later on, you know, poetry became therapy, a way to process anger, a way to process disappointment, a way to process puberty, a way to process learning about injustices in the world and finding a safe place, you know, to express how I felt and what I thought about that. And then it just grew from there. I got to the point where I wasn't interested in the other things that I was enrolled in. I was actually at a university to study engineering. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this in 5 years, right?
Uh-huh.
And I had no idea what I really wanted to do. So I just asked myself, I was like, well, what have I always been doing? And it was like, oh, poetry, language is what I've always been doing all along. And so, you know, I stuck with it.
I really
Love
love
that.
that perspective. Can I just say that what have I always been doing? That's a great question to ask yourself, and I wish I had thought of it going to school. I changed my major like 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
And though nobody's really there to challenge you with that question, you know, no one asks you, so what is the one thing that always made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up or gives you chills down your arm? What's that one thing that always makes you a little bit high naturally? We don't talk that way enough, I think, in our culture.
I love that. That's so true. Robin, do you want to share a little bit before we move on?
Yeah, definitely. So what brought me to poetry? It's hard. I also had like a thing where I was like, oh, I want to write like the next great novel, like when I went to undergrad. And I took like an intro to creative writing class, and we all had to pick specializations. And I picked fiction, of course, because I was like, I'm gonna be a novelist. And my professor is like, um, maybe you should try poetry, which I think was a gentle way of saying that my fiction was very long poems. Like it was unintelligible to somebody who's like used to like a fiction thing. And the more I kind of like process my own like acceptance of myself as like very much a poet, um, I just think like poetry is really forgiving of like things that fall outside of like normalized language. And it just provides space for like exploring that in a way that not that fiction can't, because I love a lot of fiction that's like experimental and doing stuff like that. But I didn't feel like I had that space in that genre that poetry gave me. Especially because also like I'm dyslexic and I have like a reading disorder thing that was never thoroughly diagnosed. So like words on a page are kind of hard for me, but like poetry always is like forgiving. It's like if your words seem strange, they're like creating something new. Like people aren't going to be like, oh, well, you said that wrong. But I can be like, oh, well, it's a poem, you know? I said it how it came. Yeah.
How you felt, and that's always
Yeah.
right. So awesome. I think that's a really good segue, and it's going to sort of inform like what you know, this today's topic is, you know, well-versed backgrounds in that, you know, I mean, I didn't share necessarily how I got into poetry, so I'll share that. But I had an English lit teacher that used to encourage us to free write, and free write I think was her way of also really managing like personalities and students completely wilding out. And so it was focus time that you absolutely had to free write, and that's what started me into writing, into poetry, because I've never been a person that can be told to do a thing just for no reason. So I needed to give it some kind of form, something that where it started to make sense for me, and that's what happened. And so I've moved all over, and for my 40 some odd years here on earth, and I've taken those notebooks with me, and I cherish them, and I put them in places where only I can see, because some of them are not for public consumption. But having said that, I think this is a good point for us to kind of talk about diversity in literature, and in particular to poetry, in terms of narrative and in terms of voices in the written word. How as a society do you think we're doing? Give me your honest opinion in terms of what you're seeing, what you're reading. How are we doing?
I can say that as an instructor, I'm part of a couple of pedagogical groups, I guess, online where I try to follow, especially within creative writing, even though I'm teaching composition right now. I try to follow what is so current in the creative writing community. Like, what are we teaching the next generation of writers? And there is so much discussion on how to diversify the reading lists that I want to get back into it so badly. I can't wait because I mean when I went through undergrad and grad school under 10 years ago, and it wasn't even then there was an attempt at diversifying the voices within the classroom, but there still wasn't as much yet. Now it's like that has become the requirement. This is what university professors and instructors want. They're like, I'm done with my old stuff. I'm revamping everything. Whatever you guys have, share with me now. And there are workshops and textbooks completely based on decolonizing the classroom. And those textbooks now are going on sale and being spread like wildfire. They're everywhere now, and I can't wait to be able to get back in the classroom and be able to use them. And I think that there's an attempt. It's happening. I don't know how drastically yet because I haven't been in a creative writing classroom in a while, but it's happening.
Anybody else want to? Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yes. My first response when you asked that question was better. It's
Better.
better. hmm And I agree with Lana, but when she messed around and said that word decolonizing the classroom, right? The first thing that came to my mind is how can you decolonize a classroom if you're the colonizer?
That's such a good question. Yes.
Which is something that a lot of people really don't want to talk about. A lot of people don't really want to talk about the fact that very often in many schools, the faculty does not reflect the diversity of the student population. And if it really seeks to do that, then what's going to happen to some people's jobs and positions? That gets to be a really scary conversation, right? And then it also raises questions of, if I'm not Asian American, then how do I teach Asian American literature or an Asian American poet or writer or what have you? It raises those questions too. And so I think that gets to be scary for a lot of people. And I think one of the first ways to really start stepping into that, regardless as to what your orientation or background or whatever it is, in terms of the colonized and the colonizers and all of that kind of stuff, is to listen. It's to listen, to put feelers out there, find new work, and then understand that you're presenting it from the first word that comes to mind is you're presenting it from a deficit, right? Because you don't know that experience. So then how do you present it? You lay it out there and you open the floor for questions and interpretations, and you listen more deeply, and we look for what we have in common with it. I think the biggest problem is when people try to take those things on and they feel like they know it. They know that experience, they know that background because they've studied history or because they have a certain degree. And it's like, you may not know everything, right? And that's a touchy space to be in.
I think you're right though that opening up the discussion in the classroom to be able to ask those questions. I would hope that the people teaching it are those people asking questions as well. Like they're not the teachers in those moments, but rather they are part of the collective student body. And hopefully that engages students more to ask questions, seeing that their teacher is also asking questions, excuse me.
But see, that's the hard thing because most teachers make the worst students. I'm an instructor too, right? And most instructors make the worst students because we're supposed to feel like we know everything, right?
Mhm.
And that's a really humbling position to be in.
I think,
Yeah,
Robin, I want you to, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead, jump in.
I was just gonna speak to that and say that like I feel very similarly. Like just teaching. Taught like intro creative writing classes, and I was always trying to be like there isn't one interpretation of a poem. Like I want you guys to like open this up. And at the same time, I started to get like pushback, and I felt like people didn't always respect my authority because I'm like small and like kind of effeminate queer person. And so I guess something. I mean, I don't have a question about it, but I guess I'm just thinking about as an educator, like also managing like I don't have a right word for it, but I guess I'm just thinking about how difficult it is to like navigate in that space while like trying to destabilize that like teacher student like hierarchy kind of thing. Um, yeah.
That's a good, that's a honest um, piece of like feedback too. And I'll say that, you know, when if I look at how we're doing from a diversity and voice in terms of poetry and creativity, I think we're doing better than we were a year ago, but and certainly 5 years ago. And there's been some huge shifts. Like right now, the U.S. Poet laureate is one of my favorites, Joy Harjo, a first indigenous poet laureate in America. Let that like sort of marinate, right? The first. So and you're seeing more and more content being published. But if you were to do a quick Google search, you would see the top tens or the top 50, and there's very limited diversity. So having said that, it's good to know where we're at because you can actually audit, right? And see like where we are. We're doing better, but how can we? And that's the thing that I think that's where I'm at with it. And how can we bring in more diversity? How can we bring in voices in an authentic way? And I think because students and most of us actually our introduction to literature and to poetry in particular is in the classroom, that's a big piece in that, you know, curriculum needs to sort of be more flexible. Rather than it being just Latoya or Robin, the instructor, delivering that content, maybe we have to shake that up. And whether it's presentations, whether it's other experiential ways so you can expose people, and in particular students, directly to the person that actually created that content, I think that would help us kind of grow and really start to push the needle. Because my concern is that, you know, because that's the introduction, that if we don't not just if we don't add some creativity, some flexibility into that introduction, that we won't move. And this moment of time where there's been some shifts and some actions in a positive way, that it'll just be a moment in time and we'll revert back to what we've often done. So that's my hope. And you know what, you know, in order to really see where we are, well, I guess in 2 years from now, we can reconvene, maybe in person actually, and see and ask the question again in that how are we doing? So the other question, I think, and it ties to that a little bit, and I really want you guys to kind of be completely candid. And you shared a little bit before, but just really completely candid about, and my question is, why is representation so important? What has the lack of it taught us?
I hate to be the
Whenever
one
you
to
ask a
always.
question and the first thing is, that's not usually a good sign, but no, let's go. Let's have at it. Because we want to have some tangible, like, tips for people when they leave this session, right? So have at it. Let us know what your thoughts are.
So I think this is a basic human thing for when it comes to empathy, but feeling that need to, and not necessarily fit in, but that acceptance. Like when you're growing up, you think that you want to fit in. You think you want to be another, what is it, carbon copy of everyone else because it's just easier. And then in adulthood, you become an adult and you realize, oh, nobody wants to be like anybody else. Everybody's their own person. Why why do we feel the need to have to fit that puzzle so strongly? I don't know. But I know that that really messed me up growing up as a first generation immigrant. I I constantly questioned how I was being raised, not just at home with my family and my parents, but within the education system, where at school where you make all of your friends as a kid. Then when you're 16, 17 at work, when you start to meet other people too outside of those circles, you start to realize that it's not that you want to be like them, but you want them to be able to hear a story that you share and smile at the end of it instead of cringe. I got that a lot. I'd share things about the way I was being raised, with my language. When people would find out, because I'm obviously white passing, and I didn't wear the hijab my whole life, and people would think that I was Greek or Italian, and it was so cool and that's so exotic. Until people would realize, oh, you're Middle Eastern. Oh, you are fluent in Arabic. You read, write, and speak it. Oh, you're also Muslim. It was like this domino effect of like, oh, you're one of those. And it wasn't any more of the like the smiling, any of the smiling or the attempts at acceptance that I would get were forced, faked, and so transparent. I remember after 9/11 happened, kids that I went to school with for, I don't even know, at that point it was like 5 or 6 years, suddenly we had this big assembly in the auditorium where the principal was trying to explain everything to the student body, and all my friends were turning around like, where are you from again? Suddenly it mattered.
Yeah. I can see in your face like how visceral it was. So thank you for being so transparent and vulnerable with something that's so personal. And that's kind of what we're trying to get to, is why this is so important. Does anybody else want to share, or sort of along those lines?
I guess I'm thinking about how like I didn't feel like poetry was like something I could actually pursue until I read. So there's this anthology called Troubling the Line, which is like an anthology of queer and trans poetics. And I remember reading it and feeling like who I am like felt like legible. Like I think that making like that representation made me feel like how I experience the world could be legible and could be like, and then someone else could see that and also feel um, just that their experience could be something communicated. Because sometimes like pre-existing forms didn't feel like, I don't know, I would read poetry sometimes and not feel like I could communicate that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like recently I'm reading this is kind of, it's tangentially related, I'll make it related. I'm reading a collection of diary entries by a trans man who lived in the 1960s. And it's very loosely edited, and like reading him express things that like I feel like in the present is like, I don't know, it's just like mind blowing. And I think that kind of like, that tangibility and legibility that it can give you, um, life altering.
Yeah. And imagine, right? Thinking just at that time frame, at a time where we had to social distance, that it still evoked that kind of emotion, and there was a connection there in a time where we weren't as able to connect, and that's part of why it's so important, right? Poetry is so rich, it's so vulnerable, and it's like a common thread, I think, amongst us, right, as to why that's so important. Before we move on, Tamara, did you want to share, or um
Yes, I do. I have a theory. Representation matters because if someone or someone's or a group are misrepresented or underrepresented or erased, then that becomes the perfect avenue for oppression, period, right? If I can look at you and say you're not human, or you're second class, or you're other, or you're those people, then, you know, psychologically, I can come up with all kinds of reasons why I can mistreat you and dismiss you and a whole bunch of other things, right? But if representation matters, then it challenges me to see the humanity in everyone else, even if it's someone that I disagree with, or if it's someone that I don't understand. I'm acknowledging their humanity. That's what representation does. But if you're not represented, it's easy for people to dismiss you. It's easy for another group to feel like they can control you. It's easy for another group to feel like they can also obliterate you. That's where genocides come from. You know, this feeling that you have the right to, you know, get rid of or dismiss someone or something else. And that's why representation matters, whether there's an agreement or a disagreement. There's the honoring of being, period. And to me, that's why poetry counts, and why poetry is everything, and why poetry is the perfect vehicle, because poems are written about everything and everybody. If you look even a little bit, you're going to find a poem that represents an experience and that makes somebody feel validated, just like Robin just said. I was literally in the second session that we had right after the keynote this morning at 10 o'clock. I was literally sitting there in tears listening to this woman talk about not being represented in these books that she so desperately loved, not being represented in her classroom and always feeling other. And I was moved to tears because I realized I never had that experience. I never ever had it. And it just made me all of a sudden realize how very privileged I was to never feel like that. Even though I was reading those books, I never felt like that. And thinking about how her journey of how long it took her to tackle that issue. And so this idea of misrepresenting or not representing someone at all, it just makes it too easy to be dismissive. Just way too easy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and we talked about this a little bit too, and I love what you just said. So much of poetry and literature and the written word, we get introduced to it in the classroom, and some of us never leave the, you know, square foot block or whatever in our community. Some of us never leave our city, our state. But when you have representation in the written word and you have introductions throughout your sort of educational experience, you actually get to share space with people through the written word in a way that you wouldn't have if you didn't have that piece of creative in front of you. And it humanizes you, whether or not it's personal to you. You can read about, you can read through poetry or someone's work and be jetted off to where they were from an emotional standpoint, but from also a geographic standpoint. You're there because that's what poetry does in a way that other forms don't as well. You completely are like, you feel that person, where that person was, and you're not quite the same, you know, after you read those 3 or 4 verses, because you went there. And I think, you know, just based on what everybody shared, that's why it's so important. And for us to not get so happy with ourselves that, yeah, we have some of these things, it's moving in the right direction, but we shouldn't be satisfied. Representation matters. That means we have to constantly be working at it because we have to see each other. I think if we go through 2020 and we don't come out thinking that we have to see each other, then that whole year was a complete waste and a wash. And poetry, the written word, helps us kind of get there. So thank you so much for sharing that. I swear we could actually probably go on for hours on just this topic, but we only actually have about 6 more minutes before, or a few more minutes before. And I want to hear what you guys are reading. And here's why. We just talked about representation. We just talked about why it matters. That's my sneaky little way of getting some shout outs for some content people should be reading if they're not. So indulge me. What are we reading right now that people should pick up?
Can I
Besides
answer
everybody's
something
books, of course.
answer something else right quick first before
Yeah,
you
yeah,
do
yeah.
that? Because you asked a little while ago about some suggestions in terms of diversifying, and Robin also made me think of this in terms of the classroom experience. One of the things that I've been doing that for me has worked really well in the classroom and with groups, when I create assignments for my students, I do just that. I create an assignment, period. I do not give a topic. I create an assignment with parameters and requirements. The student chooses the student's own topic, period. I had a student write to me, did a reflection on an evaluation of a composition that was, graded. And he said that, he really, felt like his paper was great, and that, if the subject had not been so lackluster, he would have gotten a much better grade on the paper. And so we talked about that as a class, and one of the students, mind you, immediately said she did not give us a topic. We chose our own topics. Therefore, if there is lackluster, it has nothing to do with me, right? But I also want to say that it has introduced me to some amazing work, right? It has introduced me to some amazing poets and poems that I never would have thought of before, because the students are choosing their own poems. I choose things to introduce them to a unit or something like that. But when it's time for an assignment, they choose their own, and it makes it much more engaging and personal from them. And it's also more engaging for me because I get to learn new material. So I just wanted to mention that. And I think this generation too, just like you were saying, Toya, for you, it's like, I need to know what the meaning behind this is and what this has to do with me personally. There's a whole generation that is out there like that. And they're not going to just take your rules and regulations and run with them anymore. So when you allow them to choose their own subjects, it helps them to connect. They reach out to connect, and it's very helpful.
Awesome. I love that. And I was just laughing. I was just like, did he not read the instructions of that assignment? Like, you just completely called yourself out, bro.
You
Very
see
many
the
don't.
look on my face? Ugh.
That's true.
Oh,
Like,
right.
read the syllabus first thing, right? No, I didn't do that. Awesome.
Is there not a meme on that? It's in the syllabus. It's in the syllabus.
Like, come
So
on.
I want to mention right quick what I'm reading before I forget. I just read um, Damaris B. Hill's book, A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing. And she talks about the incarceration of African American women. However, when she's talking about incarceration, she's not just talking about behind physical bars. She's talking about women, and sometimes very everyday women, who have spoken up for human rights and things like that, and the consequences that they've dealt with as a result of that. Sometimes being raped, sometimes being incarcerated, sometimes being shot, but sometimes being murdered or what have you. And so it's, this collection of women, and she writes poems for each one of these women, and she considers each one to be a love poem. And so when she says a bound woman is a dangerous thing, she means bound in terms of oppression, but also what binds us together in this struggle to be free and to be recognized as human. And so, as a matter of fact, okay, this is my absolute shameless plug. I just got the opportunity yesterday to interview her for a poetry conversation series that I'm doing. And it's on my YouTube channel. And I'm trying to have a conversation with a poet that everyday people would be interested in, whether they read and write poetry or not. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Other recommendations? What you reading? Don't make me pick on you.
It's hard to know where to start. I I usually try to read like a few books at once, right? But I'm lucky that I'm at my bookshelf, so I'll hold up the books. This book called The Malevolent Volume by Justin Philip Reed is really, I don't know, like mind-blowing poetry. Awesome. I'm doing
I
rapid
almost
fire.
pulled that book up too, Robin. I almost pulled that book up too.
Really?
I
I've
did.
just been thinking about it. I read it like 2 weeks ago and I haven't stopped. Time is a thing the body moves through. It's a really long essay kind of about queer and trans embodiment, but also just about like loving queer relationships. It's really beautiful. And then I just read Obit too, which I was really excited about by like the form. It's a lot about like death and grieving, but good books. Yeah, that's
Thank
all I
you.
got right now.
And I love that you showed them. So now I won't feel so geeky when it's my turn. Lana, your turn, your turn.
Okay, so I have a couple of go-tos, and I'm talking like I'm picking up poetry books because I can read one or two in between the chaos of my children. And one of my go-tos has been If They Come For Us by Fatima Asghar, and it's Asghar. And it's about having to flee your homeland. And it's happened for thousands of years. It's just, and it's continuing to happen. Just people are being kicked off of their land. People are being kicked out of their countries. And then they're not being accepted into safety by other countries. Like, so where do they go, and how do they live? And it's her memories and her family's experience within each poem in a different way, whether it's how do I deal with the fact that I've lost my home while I'm in a new home, and then how do I deal with the fact that my family and their stories that they've shared with me, being kicked out of their homeland. Like, how do I go through life knowing that generations of my family have just been gotten rid of, been pushed out? And so that's one of my go-tos. Like, it sits on my table stand in my living room. So when I get the 5 minutes where no one's looking, I can pick up and read two poems. And so I'm working through my collections very slowly because it's the only way I can do it. But another one is Danez Smith, Don't Call Us Dead. And that's a really big one out right now. And she's pulling it up, isn't she?
I had to grab my
You're
paper.
writing it down?
Yeah, I was like trying to sneak and write these down, but this is going to be recorded so we can rewind back to get all the titles. But that's awesome. And this is, just goes back to why representation is so important. Had I not asked that question, I don't know that I would have had the variety of books that I now have to go buy. So that's so helpful. That's so great. And I'll answer the question too, because I know we're running out of time. But so this is my go-to. This is the collection of poems from Audre Lorde. Like, I actually just go through this collection all throughout the year. I don't really have a reason for it. I just always go back. And especially when I'm trying to work through like where I'm at, how I'm feeling about things, this is one that I go to. But one of my legit favorites this past year, like, literally I felt like I was just swimming at certain points or just like elevating up into the clouds, is an anthology of poems from Native poets, our Indigenous American poets, and it's called When the Light of the World Was Subdued and Our Songs Came Through. I cannot tell you how many times, and I don't read chronologically, so I'm just sharing this with the crowd, but like where I would just flip and land on something and just sit there and just enjoy it, or have my heart be completely broken, but still go back for more whenever. So this is one that I really, really, really can't recommend enough. And then lastly, of course, we've got 4 poets on here. Go buy all of our books, people, for God's sakes. I mean, you have a built-in recommendation list by just having us, and that's my shameless plug. And we're trying to help you through the written word. So, there we are. But this has been like a joy of a time. We literally are at time. Thank you so much for everyone for sharing your candor, your vulnerability. Thanks to the Winter Park Book Festival team, Rochelle, everybody over at the Writers Atelier. And that's it. We're done.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
I just want to say a personal thank you to all of you for being here and sharing your knowledge. Was such a great discussion, and I really thank you for opening yourself up and your honesty. So I think it was good. Anne, did you want to say something?
Just a final thank you. Thank you guys for doing this. This was really, really awesome, really informative, really interesting. So you're all rock stars, and a special thank you once again to Raquel for really helping put this together and making it, I think, the success that it was. So well done, everybody. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.